This world that we're in, it will only last one more day.
In the latest Ghibli film, Mahito Maki is dragged down into a fantastical world in his quest to find and rescue his mother, who was killed in a firebombing raid in World War II. This magical world he finds himself in is full of strange creatures, but particularly birds, herons, pelicans, and parakeets who hunt and kill the other innocent creatures of this world. As we watch a cloud of adorable spirits, souls drift up into the sky, a horde of pelicans descend upon them, devouring them, and we are horrified. Because of course we are. A character intervenes, and in the aftermath, as Mahito faces down against one of the surviving pelicans, bloodied and beaten, he asks the pelican, "Why would you do this?" And the pelican replies, "We had no choice. The ocean has few fish. We flew as far as our eyes could see, as our wings could carry us, but the spirits are our only way to survive. We did not choose this world. We were born into it." As Miyazaki so often does, he turns our expectations of good and evil, of right and wrong, of horror and sorrow around. What does it mean to be evil in a world where you're trying to survive? How do you live in a world where so much suffering is outside your ability to control or change? Despite Ghibli films being known for their whimsy, their joy, full of life and color, there's also this deep, underlying, persevering sense of melancholy and sorrow at the state of the world, and how we're meant to navigate it. How, they ask, are we meant to live in this world at all? This video, like all of them, but especially this one, is only possible because of my amazing patrons. Oh my gosh, a squirrel! There's a squirrel, sorry. Only possible because of them and the people who have bought my books. Thank you so much. It means the world. Links down below. The latest Ghibli film is about a lot of things. It's about war, it's about trauma, it's about the power and escapism of fantasy, but at its heart, it's about that melancholy. And it's about the man himself, Hayao Miyazaki. It's his most autobiographical film yet, literally and psychologically, which is partly why this film is so metaphorical and at times abstract. These questions have shown up in Ghibli's work before, like in The Wind Rises, exploring an engineer who wants to be good in a world that wants him to make warplanes. But the answers they give have never been quite as vivid as they are in this film. Because Mahito does find his mother in this world that he escapes into, a younger version of her, and he cannot bear to leave her behind. He wants to take her with him. She is so full of life and joy, something he has not been able to find for himself. So much so that he self-harms at school, taking a rock and smashing his head with it to knock himself out, to escape this normal world he can't bear, to isolate himself. And he flees to this fantastical world he finds a portal to. Mahito's father, much like Miyazaki's himself, manufactures parts for warplanes, and Mahito is conflicted over this, even resenting his father a little, keeping him at an arm's length, not being entirely open with him. How could his father be a cog in the system that killed his mother? How is he meant to go on living in a world like this? Not just one without his mother, but a world so permeated with suffering where humans are constantly terrible, and he knows now everything you've ever loved will die and nothing will be the same. In his memoirs, Miyazaki writes, "We humans are truly irredeemable, a full condemnation of everything we are, and yet, at the same time, I know Miyazaki says, I want to create a film that tells children it is good to be alive. We cannot be redeemed, everything will come to dust, and yet it is worth living on." And that's what this film is. The Boy and the Heron is a film that places us at the end of everything and asks us to face it and continue on to find something new. At the end of the film, Mahito is finally brought to meet the architect of this fantastical world, the very person who created it, who crafted it, and he reveals that he wants Mahito to take over. He would become the god of this world. He could make it whatever he wanted. He could build it to be free of evil and pain, and that is what Mahito has been searching for, right? He's been searching for a world away from his pain, where he has some semblance of control, away from a world created by humans set against each other. He feels like that pelican. Mahito, like us, did not choose this world. World War II lingers in this moment at the end of the film, when an Emperor General Parakeet threatens to destroy everything. Miyazaki sees the modern world not only as darker and more violent, but enabling our darker tendencies. In a sense, Miyazaki believes it is harder to live in this world than ever before. It is perhaps harder to live at all. There are greater extremes. Whether or not that's true. As he asks, both in The Wind Rises and in his memoirs, this question must have been pertinent and on his mind. What is greater? What we gained from airplanes, or what we lost due to them? In The Boy and the Heron, this is both literal in the form of Mahito losing his mother, and metaphorical in the form of the flying pelicans devouring the souls of the living. But faced with this choice, whether to become the god of this fantastical world he has escaped to, Mahito has grown by this point in the film, and he rejects the offer because he realizes he has to return to the real world. He must live in it. It is, in a sense, a moral imperative to go on and find beauty again. For a man with such a dark view of humanity, this film is a resounding rejection of the nihilism that Miyazaki himself seems to swing to and fro from in his writings, and to be honest, something that I swing to and fro from as well. Mahito does return to the real world, but he does so without his mother. He tries to warn her about her death, like he can possibly avoid it, but she says she's not worried, that it will happen, but it's all been worth it to have lived a life with a boy like him. For Ghibli, and perhaps Miyazaki himself, death is not something to be afraid of, but living without hope or joy, falling into that melancholy. Terrible things are inevitable, but despair is not. More than that though, Mahito realizes that he couldn't become the god of this world that part of him wishes he could be. He cannot create a world free of bad things, of pain and despair and grief and misery, because there are troubles inside of him. He points to how he tried to hurt himself earlier in the film, that even if he were to escape here and make it however he would like, those troubles would still be with him. That everywhere we go, we take ourselves with us. We cannot escape ourselves, and we are full of pain. This would be escapist, but it would still be a fantasy. We cannot abdicate ourselves of this world, leave it and become apathetic. Like the pelican, we did not choose this world, but we must live in it. This melancholy about the decline and rupture of our world, of all that is beautiful, of all that makes life living, and yet still facing it, underpins a lot of Ghibli's works. Princess Mononoke is almost apocalyptic. It's a swan song for the natural world, inevitably in decline in the face of humanity, and yet still finding beauty in it today. Howl struggles to face the horrors of the world alone and nearly loses his soul in it. In that despair, that melancholy, he has to find a better way forward in himself. Even Kiki's delivery service, which places us in the most uplifting, beautiful world we could ever have seen with the lowest stakes possible. And yet Kiki burns herself out and falls into this depressive state. The whole quest is for her to find a new way forward, to find beautiful things again. Ghibli's melancholy is simultaneously existential and deeply personal, because our answer, whatever it is, has to be deeply personal. Over and over he asks, how are we meant to live in this world where humans are irredeemable and pain is inevitable, and we're gonna keep screwing things up for ourselves and others because we did not choose this world? Ghibli's environmental messaging is especially poignant today, when ecological collapse has become almost a personal despair. It is something we are at fault for, and yet no matter what we do on an individual level, it feels like we can't stop it, and flowers are blooming in Antarctica. There is this deceptive comfort to that melancholy I've seen a lot of. It's tempting to think there's some virtue in being miserable because you're aware of the woes of the world, especially when being miserable doesn't necessarily translate to doing anything about it, especially because sometimes we can't do anything about it. We're paralyzed. Like feeling powerless is some kind of moral high ground people try to attain when it's not. It's cynicism masquerading as wisdom. And Ghibli films, especially The Boy and the Heron, reject this utterly. See, The Boy and the Heron actually has a different title in Japanese. It's called How Do You Live? Referencing the 1937 Genzaburo Yoshino novel, How Will You Live? In fact, Mahito even has this very book with him in the film. Throughout his memoirs, Miyazaki has spoken numerous times of the impact Yoshino's book has had on him throughout his life. It's about the struggles of not just growing up as a kid, but as a human being in this immensely complex world that we did not choose. It asks, how do we live in a society, in a world so full of conflict and suffering that it's outside our control, that we perhaps can't even comprehend or grapple with, in a world we did not choose? It makes us all that pelican. The book gives a number of philosophical lessons, but Miyazaki talks about it in a way in his memoirs that really sums up The Boy and the Heron. When Yoshino poses the question of how will you live, he means we should go on living despite all of our problems. He isn't saying that if we live in a specific way that the problems will disappear and everything will be fine. He is saying that we must seriously think about things and that, while enduring all sorts of difficulties, we must continue to live, even if we ultimately die in vain, even if to die in vain. Yoshino was unable to write directly about the violence of his times, so all he could tell us to do when such times arrive is to keep living without giving up our humanity. Genzaburo Yoshino knew that was all he could do. I try to do my best in a radius of 5 meters around me, for I feel ever more certain what I discover there is real. It is better to make 3 children happy than to create a film for 5 million. What does a person do in times like that? And you might automatically say fight, resist, rebel, but Miyazaki has always been more concerned with the ordinary person, of what they're really capable of in times like that. After all, what do most people do when times like these arise? We keep producing warplane parts. Howl's Moving Castle isn't Howl's perspective so much as Sophie's. The Wind Rises is about an ordinary, flawed man who ends up creating warplanes of immense destructive power, even if he doesn't support the war. The Boy and the Heron 2 is about an ordinary kid without the power to change the world he finds himself inhabiting, but searching for a way to live in it. Mahito can't live in a way to fix those worldly problems, but that doesn't mean he shouldn't live with humanity, that he should give into that melancholy, that he shouldn't live in such a way, as Miyazaki says, to show children it is good to be alive. And even if it's tempting for us to give into the melancholy of not being able to fix the world's problems ourselves, to despair and give up, we still can change the world immediately around us. Miyazaki's films are rejections of that nihilism, of running away, of isolation, of giving into that melancholy, because ultimately choosing to live in this world is the most important and also the most ordinary step. When Mahito is given the opportunity to become the god of this world, to create it anew, the architect shows him how that is done. He shows him a stack of blocks precariously stacked atop of each other. And he can stack these blocks any way he wants to create the world as he likes, but he has to do it every few days. This world would be fragile, imperfect, like any of us are, and every few days it might topple over completely. The stones he was meant to build this world out of were made from fragments of gravestones. In other words, these worlds it's so tempting to escape into, of apathy, of melancholy, of abdication, away from suffering, away from death, are built on top of death, on grief, on pain, on loss and misery. Maybe death from disease like tuberculosis in The Wind Rises, or suffering at the hands of humans like in Howl's Moving Castle, or suffering of the natural world like in Princess Mononoke. But even as Mahito leaves this fantastical world with this swelling, gorgeous music that suggests something more beautiful is coming out of this, he takes one of those rocks with him, he slips it into his pocket. We're told it has no creative power now. He can't create a world for him to escape into with it. But it is important, because how do we live? We can't ignore this, we can't suppress it, we have to take it with us, but we don't have to give it power over us. And for Miyazaki, this is something we have to actively resist. I don't know if this was intentional, but when Mahito smashes the rock into his head, that self-harm, it's quite visceral, and it brought suicide into the conversation for me. Because the quest to find something to live for, a way for us to continue on, is something I have encountered so many times as a self-harm and suicide counselor. It's a deeply personal process. It is something you must not do once, but every day. It's something that you must reinvent and rethink and re-articulate to yourself to convince yourself of it sometimes. Humans create art as a way of negotiating with themselves. We create stories that say things not necessarily because we are convinced of them, but because we want to be convinced of them. And maybe Miyazaki's like that. In his memoirs, there is a lot of despair about humanity and the world, and yet he creates art that speaks to overcoming that. We are small people, each in our own small worlds, and yet even if we can't change the world, we can change ourselves inside it. Maybe Miyazaki is trying to convince himself of that. I don't know. I don't know the guy, but I know that's how I feel about my art. That's what I see in what he's saying. You might know Miyazaki has flirted with retirement several times now, and every single time he drags himself out and creates another masterpiece. But each time his films have become almost more intimate, more reflective, more and more like his memoirs. He is thinking about what he's going to leave behind, his legacy. And I can't escape the feeling that each of these films are part of a composition of a goodbye, a farewell. The Boy and the Heron could well be his last, and yet there's also rumors that he's going to continue on. Even if it is part of this long goodbye, I know The Boy and the Heron will stay in my mind forever, and I'm sure it'll echo into the future in the minds of so many others as well. Because it asks a question that we are always going to be struggling with. How do you live? I am always trying to make videos which go deeper and further than normal, to take my time to do these topics justice, and I'm only able to do that because of the people who have supported me on Patreon or bought my books. It means I can take risks like this one that I don't know will do that well, or more writing videos. And if you do like those soft, colorful Ghibli worlds, then I've got a story in this book about a girl found on a beach where all forgotten things wash up. It's called On the Beach of Forgotten Things. And if you want to learn more about writing stories like Ghibli, like Miyazaki, then these books are for you. Over 100,000 copies have already sold. All of this means you can support me and the artists I work with directly, and I don't have to do nearly as many sponsorships. And if you want to join my Patreon, you get to help me figure out how to make these videos. Stay nerdy, and I will see you in the future.